All right, settle in, because today we're not fact-checking a dictator's speech. We're going back to December 7th, 1941, and pulling apart one of the most talked about, theorized about, and frankly misunderstood events in American history. Pearl Harbor. You've heard the headlines. You've seen the movies. You probably absorbed at least 3 incorrect facts from a history teacher who was also coaching football and clearly had somewhere else to be. So let's do what we do here and actually look at what happened, what people got wrong, what the Japanese military was banking on, and why. Spoiler, it did not go according to plan in any way that actually mattered. Buckle in. Red door or green door, Pearl Harbor? Let's find out. First, the setup, because context is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, and we need to appreciate just how long this train had been heading toward the station. Japan and the United States had been on a collision course for decades before a single plane left a carrier deck. Japan had been expanding aggressively through Asia, into Manchuria in 1931, deeper into China by 1937, and the Americans were watching all of it with increasing irritation. The U.S. responded with trade restrictions and eventually, in 1941, a full oil embargo. Now Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States at that point, so from Tokyo's perspective, this wasn't a polite diplomatic disagreement. This was an existential economic chokehold, and they needed a way out of it fast. So the Japanese military looked at their options, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto landed on what he thought was a bold, clever, game-ending idea. Hit the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor before the U.S. could mobilize, knock them out before they even knew what was happening, and buy Japan enough time and enough Pacific breathing room to secure the resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia it desperately needed. The plan was genuinely elaborate. 6 aircraft carriers, 24 supporting vessels, months of secret training, pilots practicing on a replica of Pearl Harbor, radio decoys running fake transmissions so American intelligence wouldn't notice the fleet had gone quiet and moved. By the standards of the time, the operational security was honestly impressive. Not going to lie. Credit where it's due. And the Americans, to put it diplomatically, were not at their most alert. Most of the Pacific Fleet was parked in neat, perfect rows around Ford Island. Battleships lined up like they were posing for a photograph. Hundreds of aircraft were crammed onto adjacent airfields wingtip to wingtip, because the bigger concern at the time was sabotage from the ground, not an air assault, so they'd clustered everything together to make it easier to guard. Commanders Kimmel and Short had received multiple war warnings in October and November of 1941, including one on November 27th that literally began with the words, "This dispatch is to be considered a war warning." And yet, anti-aircraft guns were unmanned. The base was not on high alert. It was a Sunday morning. Here's where it gets genuinely painful. At 6:37 a.m., over an hour before the first bombs dropped, the USS Ward spotted and attacked a Japanese submarine lurking outside the harbor entrance. Sank it, reported it up the chain. Nothing happened fast enough to matter. Then, around 7 a.m., 2 radar operators at the Opana station picked up a massive incoming signal on their screen. A huge formation of aircraft bearing down on Oahu. They reported it. The officer on duty told them it was probably the scheduled arrival of American B-17 bombers coming in from the mainland. It was not B-17s. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave hit. The Americans had 2 separate warnings within the same morning and managed to act on neither of them. Honestly, not looking great. The attack came in 2 waves, about 45 minutes apart, and lasted a total of 110 minutes. When it was over, 2,403 Americans were dead, 1,178 were wounded. Nearly 20 naval vessels had been sunk or seriously damaged, and more than 300 aircraft had been destroyed or put out of action. 8 battleships were hit: the USS Arizona, the Oklahoma, the California, the West Virginia, and more. The Arizona alone lost 1,177 men when a bomb pierced her deck and detonated her ammunition magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship sank in 9 minutes. And here's a detail that stuck with me. The Arizona had taken on nearly 1.5 million gallons of fuel the day before the attack. Some of that fuel is still seeping out of the wreck today, almost a drop at a time. People visiting the memorial call it the Tears of the Arizona. That's not poetic license. That's literally what's happening down there. Now here's where Yamamoto's grand plan starts falling apart, and falling apart badly. The Japanese had specifically identified the American aircraft carriers as the primary targets, the most dangerous assets in the Pacific Fleet, and on December 7, 1941, not a single one of them was in port. the USS Enterprise was returning from a mission to Wake Island. The Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway. The Saratoga was undergoing a refit in Puget Sound, Washington. 3 carriers, 0 in harbor. The Japanese struck Pearl Harbor and missed every single ship that would eventually beat them at Coral Sea, at Midway, across the entire Pacific campaign. That is not a small miss. That is the miss. The second thing the Japanese failed to destroy was Pearl Harbor's fuel storage and repair infrastructure. The dry docks, the machine shops, the oil tanks sitting right there. Those facilities would play a massive role in the American recovery and counterattack over the following years. American engineers raised and repaired almost every ship that went down, with the exception of the Arizona and 2 others deemed too damaged or too obsolete to bother with. The Oklahoma and the Utah stayed on the harbor floor. Everything else came back. The Japanese had attacked a naval base and somehow left the naval base largely functional. As strategic demolition jobs go, that is a C- at best. And then there's the thing nobody really wants to talk about, which is what Yamamoto himself reportedly thought about the whole operation. Japanese Admiral Hara Tadaichi, reflecting afterward on what Pearl Harbor actually accomplished, said, "And I love this, we won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." And Yamamoto, the man who planned the attack, apparently told Japanese leadership before it even happened that he could promise to run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that he had no confidence whatsoever in the outcome. He was right on both counts. Japan ran wild. Then they didn't. Midway was 6 months later. Now let's talk about the conspiracy theories, because they never go away, and some of them are actually kind of interesting to pick apart. The big one. Did Roosevelt know in advance and let it happen to drag the US into the war? The logic goes, FDR wanted to help Britain against Nazi Germany. The American public was overwhelmingly against entering the war. Something like 94% of the country opposed intervention. So maybe he let Japan hand him the excuse he needed. Here's the issue with that theory. The warnings that reached American commanders were real but fragmentary, and the actual intelligence picture was pointing toward Japanese attacks on British and Dutch territories in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. The geographic isolation of Pearl Harbor, roughly 4,000 miles from Japan, made an attack there genuinely seem improbable. American intelligence wasn't looking away from Pearl Harbor because someone told them to. They were looking away from Pearl Harbor because they had convinced themselves it couldn't happen there. The carrier conspiracy is a similar situation. 3 carriers happened to be away from Pearl Harbor on December 7th. To a conspiracy theorist, that looks suspicious. To anyone who's looked at naval scheduling, carriers were regularly out on missions and rotations. The Saratoga was in dry dock for routine maintenance. The Enterprise had just delivered aircraft to Wake Island on a standard assignment. The timing was genuinely coincidental, which is either a lucky miracle or infuriating depending on how you feel about luck shaping history. The absence of the carriers wasn't orchestrated foreknowledge. It was the kind of timing that makes military historians either grateful or furious for the next 80 years. The ripple effects moved fast. The morning after the attack, Roosevelt stood before Congress and delivered the Day of Infamy speech. And within hours, the United States had formally declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States 3 days later, pulling America fully into both theaters simultaneously. Within less than a year of the attack, 50 million Americans out of a population of 132 million were directly involved in the war effort. The mobilization speed was staggering. Factories retooled, shipyards expanded, recruitment numbers exploded. Japan had intended to paralyze American military power in the Pacific. Instead, it unified a country that had been deeply divided over whether to get involved at all and handed the U.S. government a public mandate that nobody was going to argue with. Yamamoto's inspiration for the Pearl Harbor Plan came, oddly enough, from 2 places. A 1925 novel called The Great Pacific War by a British naval writer named Hector Bywater, which described a fictional Japanese surprise attack on the American fleet and a real British raid on the Italian fleet at Taranto in November 1940, where the Royal Air Force proved that carrier-based air power could devastate a fleet in harbor. Both of those pieces clicked together in Yamamoto's mind and became Pearl Harbor, and the attack did exactly what Taranto and the novel suggested it could. It hit the battleships, caused enormous immediate damage, shocked the target nation to its core. What neither the novel nor the Taranto raid had modeled was what happens when you miss the carriers, leave the infrastructure standing, and wake up the largest industrial economy on the planet on a Sunday morning. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more.